Start with the importance and significance of Palmyra?
It's a very interesting question, is what has to happen for a monument or a site to be listed on the World Heritage List. And there are criteria that are used and are regularly invoked when one wants to put something on the World Heritage List. And remember, the way that works is a nomination is made by the state or the nation that is the holder of that property. And so they nominate what they think is important about their monument. And I was looking at that list of criteria, and part of it is the aesthetic, the splendor of the ruins, the siting of the role that Palmyra played in terms of the Silk Road trade. It was an oasis in the desert, so the caravans would stop there. It was a very rich site. Of course, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, it was one of the most important of the Roman sites that were in the Near East. And then you have, of course, the interesting aspect of it. When it was at its height as an empire, you had Zenobia, who was the queen. And then when she seemed to have gotten a little too uppity for the Romans, she's dragged off to Rome and is a captive in Rome. And there are interesting questions as to exactly what her fate was and how she was treated in Rome. So there are many factors that come into play when you consider Palmyra as an important site. There are even the aspects associated with sort of a unique aspect to their art, unique aspects to the language. And then you have, in addition, of course, the post-ruin history, if you wish, when Palmyra is, so to speak, rediscovered. Palmyra then becomes a site which, after a while, is under the French mandate. And so how the French dealt with the fact that Palmyra was the town at one point. People were living within the temple region, completely surrounding the monument, and the French come in and remove them and set up an archaeological zone with a buffer zone and so on. So you have all of that, and of course now you have the additional factor, of course, of the destruction of much of it on the basis of ISIL, as it's commonly referred to, or Daesh. So you have a whole series of historical aspects, museological aspects, site management aspects that come into play when you're dealing with Palmyra.
How and why would it be destroyed by Daesh or ISIS?
Well, that you'd have to ask them, I would suspect. Though if we look at other circumstances, when a terrorist group seeks attention, it picks a monument, something that it regards as being a symbol. And often that has nothing to do with iconoclasm or the issue of religion in any way. It may simply be a way of saying, well, you people think this is important. We're going to show you how important it is. And so you have, of course, the Taliban blowing up the Buddhas of Bamiyan. That wasn't done for religious reasons, even though that was stated. That was done basically to thumb their noses, collective noses, at the West. The same way, strangely enough, if you were to ask native New Yorkers, of which I am one of very few, about what were the symbols of the city of New York, and you started listing them, you would not put the World Trade Center very high on that list. The Statue of Liberty, Brooklyn Bridge, Empire State Building, perhaps the Chrysler Building, all of those are more symbolic of the city. And yet, to the terrorists who wanted to crash their airplanes, they chose to do so into the World Trade Towers because that had become a symbol in the other world, the world outside New York City of the city. So I think there are a couple of messages that came out of this. One message is, we'll do what we want. We don't care about what you think is important. Another message, I think, was this was a recruiting video that they were releasing. That's why they were videotaping these various destructive events and say, you too can be part of this. you're unhappy at home living in London or New York or some other city, come along and have some fun, blow up a few buildings and so on and so forth down the line.
What remains at the site, and is there a hierarchy of importance among what's left?
Well, I did a little bit of checking to see what the status of things is at UNESCO with regard to this World Heritage Site. And it's rather interesting. Things have been rather quiet as far as UNESCO is concerned. And they sent a team out to evaluate the site and see what was left and what was damaged. The question in terms of what is left, the great deal has been destroyed. After all, if you look at archaeological sites throughout the world, they're archaeological sites because they've been destroyed, either by natural events. If you take Bam in Iran, it was destroyed by a major earthquake in the recent past. It had been destroyed multiple times by earthquakes. So you have a ruin for a reason, and the reason might be either there had been a conflict, or there might have been a natural event, or there might have been a change, as occurs in some cases, where the river has dried up and you no longer have reliable sources of water, and so people move on. So when you get to the site now, you'll have a ruin, and you'll have a rather badly damaged ruin. You'll have things that have been removed from the site, and that will be the first step, actually, is to go to the site and see exactly what remains, look at it in detail. One has to remember, it is still a site that is not completely secure. You can't walk the site absolutely comfortably, making the assumption that there are no bad guys out there who might well attack you.
And how is the situation at Palmyra unique? Are there steps to follow sequentially when damage like this occurs?
I think one has to say that the situation is unique only in the willful destructiveness, the attempt to either cart off and sell or destroy anything they could get their hands on. It's rather interesting, there were two phases after all in Palmyra. The initial capture of the site by ISIS, then the expulsion of ISIS from the site, then the return. In the first period when they had it, they actually used the theater as a backdrop for some of the horrific acts they carried out, executions and so on. When they came back, they decided, I guess, that they no longer needed it in the same way as a backdrop for their videos. They had all they needed, and so they started destroying the site as well. So if you look at that aspect of it, there is a way in which Palmyra is unique. On the other hand, the destructive acts with regard to sites, if you think in Mosul that the Caliph announced the caliphate from a mosque, and then as ISIS was being chased out of Mosul in the last stages of the battle, they blew up that mosque. So their own historic site was blown up by them. So one has to look at it from the point of view, there are many such examples, so it isn't unique in that sense. What is unique to some degree is the history of how they behaved when they controlled the site.
What challenges do art historians and conservators face regarding the site going forward?
Well, there are two aspects to that. One is the aspect, what has been lost that had not been recorded. And then you have to go back to the records, and the French, as the controllers of the Mandate after the First World War, they kept pretty good records. So one has pretty good records archaeologically. That doesn't mean everything was published, especially some of the tower tombs and so on may not have been fully published. So there is the question of what remains of what was unpublished, but we don't, if it's unpublished, we don't really know what was there. So we may have lost things because there was an awful lot of illegal excavation that was done simply to hope to find some things that could then be placed on the market. The next stage of it is the question of what is salvageable, what can we record, and then you have to get to the stage of what are you going to do to manage that site, where does it stand. It's interesting, I went to the UNESCO site just today to check again what the status was the last month. It's still listed as a World Heritage Site. What does UNESCO do when a site has been destroyed? It's a World Heritage Site, but it's a ruin of a World Heritage Site at this point. I don't think they've dealt with that issue, but it's a serious one they're going to have to deal with if you look at all of the sites in Syria that have been attacked and seriously damaged.
And what are the local concerns that arise when peace is reestablished, if it's reestablished?
Well, of course, all of Syria, as a point, a conflict zone. Many cities have been reduced to rubble. Deir el-Zur, for example, a major city in the eastern part of Syria, was a site of continuous fighting for several years. So if you go throughout Syria, you have many sites that have been damaged. You have people who've been displaced. After all, you have perhaps half the population has either emigrated from Syria or has been displaced within Syria. So you have an enormous human issue to deal with. You have, of course, the whole infrastructure issue to deal with. People will migrate back fairly rapidly. There is a kind of tie that one has to one's native land and to one's native possessions. And after all, if you owned a property, even though it has been damaged severely or even destroyed, you still own the land. So people will be returning, but there will be an enormous need to deal with infrastructure questions before you get around to the cultural questions.
What teachable lessons would you like to pass on to the next generation of conservators?
Well, I think here, if we are speaking in the context of Palmyra, I think the issue is have a plan, just as any organization in the developed world has, of any significance, has disaster plans where they have set up a system. If we have a flood, if we have a fire, if there's a terrorist attack, this is what you do, this is what you remove, these are the people you call, and so on. That becomes part of site management for cultural properties as well. You need a disaster plan. You need full documentation. So even if you lose something completely, you at least know what it is that you've lost. And we, of course, in this class have looked at examples where all we have now is a black and white photograph of major paintings that were destroyed in the fire and the anti-aircraft tower in Berlin.
Are there opportunities that arise when we have this kind of destruction?
Well, there are certainly opportunities in terms of documentation, in terms of returning, where you have fragments of sculptural elements and the like. There are people who wish to preserve those. There will certainly be, I'm sure there will be a major attempt to reestablish Palmyra in some form. Obviously not to re-erect Palmyra as a kind of Disneyland site, but to deal with that issue in some way. There are many places, of course, where you have similar problems throughout all of Syria and indeed in Iraq. So I think there are opportunities for all sorts of people dealing with rather special skills, such as virtual reality, which will be an aspect of it, recreating in some way the objects. But if you think back to the Buddhas of Bamiyan, we are still discussing what one should do about the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which do have a significance beyond just the historical significance, because, of course, in the case of Buddhas of Bamiyan, you're dealing with objects that have religious significance, not necessarily for the population of Afghanistan, but for others, such as, in fact, Japanese Buddhists, who are very much interested in that preservation issue. And so there'll be different groups who will have different approaches to the question of what comes next in Palmyra.
And finally, why did you become interested in conservation?
Well, let me check my watch, how much time we have. Actually, scientists these days are very much cognizant of the fact that chance or luck plays a great role in terms of one's career. In my particular case, there are a number of what you might call decision points that occurred down the line, and they just simply led in this direction. Interestingly, as a boy, I grew up surrounded by art of a single artist, namely an uncle, who had studied in the Dresden Art Academy at the same time Otto Dix, Pechstein, and many other artists were studying. He was a student there, and my father, who was the youngest of several brothers, others being a tailor in Brooklyn and so on down the line. In fact, the person who sponsored his immigration to the United States. So I would see, in fact, engravings and other scenes from Dresden throughout my early years. When I went off to college, it was time to register, and I had to fill in the days in which one had less freedom than one does now as a undergraduate. I had to fill in a kind of cultural appreciation course, and I wanted to sign up for the music course, but it was closed out, and I was a lowly freshman. So I took art history, and the art history course I was taught, in fact, by Institute alumni. One was Professor Brown, who taught for many years in Washington Square and so on, at Brooklyn College and elsewhere. That just simply fit in as a perfectly good introduction. I took classics courses and so on, but I was fundamentally a chemist. I went to graduate school as a chemistry student. And then when I was working on my doctorate, my mentor was in fact teaching at that time, half-time at the Institute and half-time in the chemistry department at NYU. And just as I was finishing my dissertation, it turned out that he was given the choice. In fact, he had to make the choice of either being full-time at the Institute or full-time in the chemistry department. And he did his own risk assessment, which was, this is a recurring theme for us, of course, risk assessment. And he decided that the chemistry department was a better bet than the conservation center where he was teaching. Just at that time, the Metropolitan Museum, which had had a chemist before the Second World War, but had not had one in the period after he accidentally killed himself while doing some experimental work at the Met. It was afraid that chemists would blow up the whole building, I suppose. But they decided that they were now rather out of the loop, that other places such as the National Gallery, Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and other museums, especially in Europe, were in fact including a scientific department. And so the issue came up, would I be interested in fact, undertaking a job part-time at the Met and part-time at the Conservation Center. As it turned out, there were these two positions that were opening up. One was, in fact, to replace my mentor. Not quite the same as Newton replacing his mentor, but still, it's along that line, at least as an analog. And so, under that circumstance, I joined the Institute as a very young faculty member in 1969. And I don't think I've regretted it one day since then, and it's now almost 50 years, both teaching and doing research at the Conservation Center.
Thank you for doing this interview.